sons studied to be lawyers, like their father. And the youngest son, Harold, remained in Randolph and practiced there all his life, and at one time was surrogate judge of the county. Darwin, who also was a lawyer, lived in Little Valley and did a general law practice. More, I believe, worked with wills, deeds, and work of that kind. I doubt if he did. I never knew of his doing any trial law of any kind. And then Charlie, who lived to be, I think, just a little over 102, passed away just 2 or 3 years ago. And he practiced there in Salamanca. And his son, who predeceased him, also was a lawyer. And his grandson, no, it would be a nephew, like Perrault, practiced with him also. Perrault was the grandson of Darwin rather than Charlie. So there were all of those lawyers from that particular branch of the family. Uncle Samuel built that house, as I say, and for many years that remained in the Wilcox family. The Wilcox family was supposed to have lived in a log cabin before this house was built. And just where that log cabin was situated, we have never known. Whether Darwin had never thought to ask his mother, or whether she was too young to remember, but the house was built in the early 1860s, and I would have expected that she would remember where it was. But anyway, none of us know. And Darwin tried to find if he could find any remnant anywhere where they thought it might have been, but they never had found any thing at all. So then Austin had a son by the name of Cassius. Cassius went out to Missouri and married a very lovely woman out there, and unfortunately Cassius was an alcoholic, and he left his family and came back to New York State, and he was an organ tuner and later piano, but he used to go about the country tuning organs. They said he was excellent at it, but every fall he would come back, usually to my father's place, and Father would buy him new clothes, and he would spend the winter at our house, and then the next spring he'd start out again, and it would be repeated again the next fall. Well, I tell that because he had a son and a daughter, and the daughter was married a Charles Groff from Portland, Oregon, and her name was Nettie. We never met her until it must have been 1932, I guess. My mother and I were out in Oregon and 31, and we spent a weekend with her. She had done a great deal of work in looking up the family genealogy and had traced us back to the Mayflower. And that's where I got the information did a great deal of research for the Mayflower organization itself, and anything that she okayed for other people was always accepted by the organization because she had done such excellent work. She had a son, but I was am of the impression that he passed away, and I know that she and her husband had both passed away. But I have she gave me her records before she died, and we will have those with the other information we're going to collect and put there. So then, as I said, their other son, another son, was Lansing, who was my grandfather. He was the one that married Miranda home. When he came to Napoli, they must have been married very shortly after they came, and he, instead of settling down on the Hardscrabble Road, as it is called, went up on Miller Hill and cleared the land and built a home up there. And Miranda died in 1867, right after the Civil War. Evidently, grandfather and Aunt Mary and Aunt Helen continued to live there. But you see, as we talked a little while ago, their brother Charlie had gone to England. He had married and gone to England. And just how soon after grandmother died, grandfather married again, I don't know. But anyway, father and mother, my father and mother were married in 1875. But grandfather, I have a copy of grandfather's will that I got from the Cattaraugus County Clerk's Office in Little Valley. And that was written in 1878, 3 years after father and mother were married. And in that will, he is willing everything to his wife Nancy, who was his second wife and whom I knew. He passed away in '94, so I never knew him. But she, the grandmother that I knew, lived until about 1903, so that I had a chance to know her. And during that time, grandfather had built a house across the road from the main house that you have seen there on Miller Hill. It was across the road and down just a little bit. When I was a girl, little girl, there was a cherry orchard there, and beautiful white lilac bushes, and a beautiful old mountain ash tree made the best, those mountain ash berries made the best mud pies that you ever saw.
What you remember about it anyway.
That's what I remember about it.
That's great.
And there were some beautiful maple trees there. And grandfather also built a barn across there, just a small horse barn, evidently. I can't quite remember. I have no recollection of their moving that barn, but we have a picture taken of them moving that barn up and attaching it to the old barn across the road, and it shows my brother Charlie and I Walter and myself with Father. They're working on it as they're attaching it there. And just, I believe it was 2 years ago when I was up there, they were tearing that down. It had become so old and rotten that they were tearing that part down, and I believe that was the last of the old barn that was really standing there when I was a girl. So evidently, when Father and Mother were married, Grandfather built this other house, and he and Grandmother and Aunt Mary and Aunt Helen went there to live. So I can remember also when Grandmother left there before she passed away, and she had been married before, and her son lived in East Randolph. Well, at first, she moved down to Nepoli Corners and lived with her sister, Mrs. Brainerd, and then she went on down to East Randolph and lived with her son, and his name was Burbank, and passed away there. The old house, that is the house that they built, was moved down toward Little Valley. Maybe 3/4 of a mile up over the top of the hill and on down through what we call the Narrows. You may recall as you're coming up from Little Valley to the farm, you come through a little strip of woods, very narrow. The hills were very close together there. It's a short strip, but it's always very pretty through there. And it was moved down through there just a short distance on the right-hand side of the road. And I do not know whether that burned or whether it just deteriorated anyway. There's no remnant of it there. I think there is a lilac bush for that, where it stood, but nothing more than that. And so Father and Mother started housekeeping there at that time. Now, Uncle Alvin, another one of the brothers in the family that had also left home, was the man who was captured by the Indians, and his obituary it doesn't tell anything about that, but it does say that at one time he went to Fort Dodge, Iowa, where he took up a homestead and taught school. And I think that it must have been sometime around that time that he might have been captured from there. But nothing was heard from him for several months. And they had just about given up hope that he was living when they finally received word. I wish that I had asked more questions about him, but I didn't. He did some of the first surveying for the Northern Pacific Railroad and for the surveyed several portions of counties of Becker County, a portion of Becker County in Minnesota, and he wrote a book called A History of Becker County, which is a very interesting book. And Marion Wilcox in Sharon, Pennsylvania, has that book. Uncle Alvin he was my uncle. Uncle Alvin was just a lovely person. Everybody loved him. And he used to come back visiting sometime. He apparently became quite a wealthy man. He had a lumber company there in Minnesota, and then he was president of the bank, and his obituary. It goes into great detail about all of the things that he did. And he is the one who gave me the cup that you have now.
While you're talking, let me see if I can find that.
All right.
Jennifer said she knew where it was.
Yes. He always brought me a gift. Probably that's one reason why I thought he was so nice.
Or rich. Right?
Yeah. But he was always very thoughtful and very kind to everyone. You know, we sometimes smile at these old obituaries. We think they're rather flowery and all, but they tell so much about individuals that we would never remember, would never be known later. And as I read them, I think, well, the obituaries that are in the paper today would certainly give no one very much information relative to a person and what they had accomplished through life. At one time I had a coral necklace, and I imagine that he brought that from Hawaii, because he and Aunt Mary Ellen, his wife, after he retired, did some traveling, and they went to Hawaii, and then but they'd also been down in the Caribbean. But I imagine they brought that from Hawaii with them. My Aunt Helen, one of their sisters, married a Judson Sibley and lived down the hill. Their house was on the same side of the highway as ours. And as a little girl, I used to love to go down there. Of course, I was named after her. And she, of course, always made a great fuss over me. And I'm sure spoiled me like some of the others said they did. They like to tell me that they did. Oh yeah.
Found that.
Yes, that's the cup that Uncle Alvin brought me.
And let me tell you this,
Mm-hmm.
that I remember about that cup, that in your home that was also your office,
Mm-hmm.
Milk was never colder and never tasted better, but when it was in that cup.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I have to also tell you that looking back on it now and looking at that cup for a kid, I had dang pretty good taste there, too. That's an awful nice little cup there.
certainly did. I had
right.
forgotten it was so pretty.
It is gorgeous. It is
Yes.
really pretty.
Uh-huh. Well,
It's no wonder I had a hard time finding it. Linda had it down underneath the glass in this thing in our dining room. I might have looked around this house for 2 days if I hadn't just happened to look down there. Uncle Alvin brought it.
And Uncle Alvin brought that to me, probably right around 1900.
Barber Silver Company quadruple, which doesn't mean anything. And it's number 226 of Lord knows how many of them they make, but it's numbered. Wonder where the Barber Silver Company.
I wonder.
Where did he bring this from?
I have no idea.
Fort Dodge, Iowa, or from one of his trips?
Oh no! This would have been from one of his trips, or he might have just picked it up, from just to bring me a present from Minnesota, because that was where he lived. As I say,
That's
my Aunt Helen lived down the road, and she was married to a Judson Sibley. When during the, I remember so well going down there at the time of the World's Fair in Buffalo. When McKinley was shot, father and mother and I don't know who else went into the fair. And so whoever remained at home was there when I awakened in the morning. And so after I got up and dressed and had my breakfast, I took my doll buggy and my dolls, and I would have been 5 years old, and went down to Aunt Helen's, and supposedly stayed down there while they were away. And she had an old melodeon, the first instrument of that type that was brought into the town of Bolai. And we don't know exactly when she got it, but it was always well preserved, and she told me as a little girl that was to be mine. And she saw to it that I did have it. So when I reached the point that I didn't have any place for it, I gave it to Marion and Theo Wilcox and Sharon. And they had not had it but a short time when Theo informed me that it had been spoken for, that their son Lyle wants it. Said that his name was on it for the next generation. It has a beautiful rosewood case. Unfortunately, one time my Christmas theme caught fire, and it ruined the very top part of the case. There was an Italian man who worked as a finisher and repairer for the furniture company in Salamanca, and he had a friend who had some rosewood, and he finally persuaded him to let him have enough of it to refinish the top of the melodeon. And he did, but unfortunately used a very hard finish instead of a soft finish, and in a very short time it crackled. I was so sorry to have it happen because it had just such a beautiful cabinet.
Lyle and I'll have to talk about his name being on that to begin with.
Yeah, you could have an argument with him.
There you go.
When you see him. There was Aunt Lucy, one of my father's sisters. She married a man by the name of Peacock. I never knew him, but everyone seemed to like him so much and think so much of him. They lived at Delanda, New York. And you go through there, going from Little Valley to Buffalo. And at one time he was commissioner to the Indians for the state. And he's buried there in Delanda. I might mention the fact that grandfather and grandmother, Lansing and Miranda Wilcox, are buried in the cemetery right there by the old home, right at the very top of the hill. The cemetery is officially is the Maple Grove Cemetery, but it's most always called the Miller Hill Cemetery. When I was a little girl, I used to love to play up there. There were always some of the biggest wild strawberries that you ever saw that grew up there in the cemetery that I used to pick. In the back corner, one of the back corners, there was a lot that was enclosed with a picket fence. And inside on the tombstone was a picture, or pictures of the deceased, with a little block of granite that was on a screw that you could push it to one side and look at the picture and write it down. And of course, that quite intrigued me. Well, evidently, in going in to see this, I had left the gate open sometime or another. And I suspect that someone had said something to my mother about it, because she told me that I mustn't go in there anymore because I couldn't close the gate. So I thought, well, if that was the only reason that I couldn't go in was that I couldn't close the gate, why, I could just jump over the fence. And it was the picket fence.
Oh, no.
And little Helen got her skirts caught out of the picket fence, and there she hung. Well, fortunately, her father and one of her brothers were out working in the garden, which was between the cemetery and their house. And they heard my screams and came to my rescue.
We're rolling, Auntie.
I think in the other unit, we had brought the family to the Hawaii, and father and mother were married and were settled on the old farm that had been cleared. The land had been cleared by my grandfather, Lansing Wilcox. You recall that grandmother Wilcox, Miranda Wilcox, had died in 1867, and he had remarried again, and evidently sometime before 1875 had built a house directly across the highway from the old home, and so that he and grandmother and Aunt Helen and Aunt Mary lived down there, and father and mother took over the home. And today I've been looking at through this picture album that in which I've collected a bunch of old pictures that of the entire family, and I thought you might enjoy seeing some of them. Okay. I don't think these two pictures of father and mother were taken at the time of their wedding, but it was very close to that. Father, at that time, was wearing a beard and a mustache, and I can just remember when he wore a beard. He always wore a close-cropped mustache, but his I can just remember when he wore a beard, and I have never forgotten when he did his shaving. He always did it in the kitchen, and there was a shelf by the outside door that had the shaving mug and his razor on it, and the razor strap was hanging on a hook there beside the door. Well, one afternoon, I went out into the kitchen, and here was Father, and he was shaving his beard off, and he evidently hadn't said anything to anybody else about it. And I rushed back in the other room, and I said, "Papa's shaving his mustache off his chin."
Mustache off his chin.
I was never allowed to forget that.
As we go through this album, we should say at this point in time, too, that in the listening outline that we're going to try to supply along with these units, we'll reproduce these pictures so that everybody can get a good look at exactly the people that we're talking about. And we'll label them figure 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on, and try to make it clear which picture is which. Okay?
Yes, that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Father, of all of the boys of the family, I think that my father and my brother Charlie were the most alike. The father was full of fun, and he was a deeply religious man, but he didn't talk about his religion. Seldom ever that I recall of my father talking about religion particularly, but he lived up to what he believed very strictly. He was superintendent of the Sunday school there in Nepali for many years. The young people of the community all loved to come to our house, and father and mother always had a crowd there. They always said that they would rather the young people would all come there so that they would know where their own children were, rather than have their own children out running around and not knowing where they were. And so as a result, they did. And I mentioned the other night that whenever I wakened in the morning and my mother was not home, I knew that she probably was out somewhere where they were having a new baby. evidently did many, many things in the community. After Mother passed away, an old neighbor told me about the time back in probably around 1890. It was before I was born. There was quite a severe attack of, well, we used to call it the grip in those days, like the flu.
Mm-hmm.
Just exactly. You ached and ran a high temperature and all. And there was a regular epidemic of it around there in the Poli, and everybody seemed to have it except my father and mother. And so in the morning, my father and mother would get up, and father would go to the barn and get his chores done. Then he would come to the house, and meanwhile mother would have made a great big kettle of oatmeal gruel. And they would start out, and they would go over to Edgar's, and father would go to the barn and look after the cattle and milk any cows that needed to be milked, and while mother went in the house and took care of the sick folks and gave them something to eat, and then they'd go on to another neighbor. I had never heard them tell that, but I can believe it. They were inclined to do things like that. And they, in their whole married life, the two of them together lived in just two different houses. We have a picture here, two pictures here of the one on the farm. At the time they were married, as I understand it, the house consisted of just this upper part here. The downstairs, as near as my brother Walter could remember, it consisted of one big room, which was evidently the kitchen and living room, a pantry, and another room, whether they used it as a parlor, which they probably did, for everybody had to have a parlor in those days, you know, it was open for weddings, for funerals, and but that was one thing that my father always said, that if the parlor was good enough for our friends, that it was good enough for his family. And so we always treated it with due respect, but we could use the parlor. Yeah. And in the parlor, there would always be the center table, a table that just sat in the center of the room, and there would be your choicest things on it. Among other things would be your old-fashioned lamp with a big globe, you know, and that would be the nicest lamp that you had. And ours, I don't know where they had gotten it, but somewhere somebody had gotten a big conch shell from somewhere, and that was always on the table. And then, and our stereopticon. Have you ever seen a stereopticon? Well, it holds a picture. The two pictures, just look at them, they look exactly alike, but they are a little bit different.
Registration slightly different.
Yes, and then you set it into a slide, and there are two lenses that you look through.
Oh, yeah.
You've seen those.
It's
Well,
the forerunner to the Viewmaster.
Yes, the forerunner to the Viewmaster, that's right.
Round reels.
Yeah.
That's right. And that was always there. You know, that was supposed to be one of the choicest things we had in the house. So I was very much interested one day, several years ago, to get hold of an old 1908 Sears and Roebuck catalog. And I looked up in there, and I found that those stereopticons cost the whole sum of 60 cents.
Oh, my God. Oh,
And the slides, the pictures, I think were a nickel piece. But those were choice things, and we had to handle them with very, very great.
Too fast.
Yes, sir.
Lindsay, can you be a little quieter with the paper? I'm afraid the folks out in TV land are going to hear nothing but you're rattling around over there, okay?
Yeah, she also needs to have a book or something. If you're going to write on this paper, you need to be writing on a book because you're going to get the pen. Like in the parlor, she can sit in our living room,
Yes,
but I
sir.
don't want her writing with ink on the pillow.
No, that's right. That's
Here's the
right.
book. Darling.
There.
You write on that?
There.
Now,
You
don't
be-
write. You write on there, but don't you write. Don't get into any more makeup.
You be quiet or you'll be in the other room, okay? Thank you, dear.
You know, times haven't changed. I think my father and mother said things just like that 80 years ago.
You think so?
I'm sure they did.
I'm sure they did too. In this house, all of my father's family had been born. Aunt Lucy, and Aunt Mary, Aunt Helen, Uncle Charlie, Uncle Alvin, and then all of our family was born. Were born in that house as well. I spoke about the combined kitchen living room. There was a door out of that went upstairs to the bedroom. And there was an outside door right at the foot of the stairs also before the house was fixed over. But I never remember of there being a door at the foot of the stairs going out of doors. But there was always this door at the foot of the stairs where we went upstairs from inside. And it was when, evidently when the house was fixed over, that was when that door was closed. And the door into the kitchen, they built on the kitchen to the back, and another big pantry and the woodshed. I suppose as our family grew, you see, in 1877, my brother Bert was born, and my brother Walter, my sister Isa, and then Walter, and then Carrie, and then Charlie, and then myself, spanning a period of from 1877 to 1896. I was the baby of the family. Spoiled.
Imagine her, Jennifer, the baby of the family. We're talking here some old folks, aren't we?
That's right. That stairway was an enclosed stairway. And as I was thinking about it last night, I thought, if that old stairway could only talk. Oh, the stories it could tell.
Stories it would tell about what you did, the things you talked about on that stairway.
There was a shelf right above the door. And with a great deal of effort, you could get up onto it. It was built in so that it was safe for a child to get up there and sit there. You couldn't do anything other than to use a pencil and paper or read a book or something, but you could get up there. But sometimes it was harder to get down than it was to get up. But the one thing that I know that every member of our family always remembered, there was no carpeting on the floor, on the stairs. So when my older brothers and sisters would go out on a date, somebody always came up with the idea of getting a dishpan, which was almost always made of tin, and filling it with other tin dishes, nothing that would break. And they would take it up and put it at the head of the stairs, and then they would put tie a long string on it, and then tie the other end of the string to the doorknob down at the foot of the stairs, and the door opened
Same
up.
thing they used to do with water.
So you're the culprits. Jack and I can blame that nasty trick on.
Yes,
Okay.
and so in the middle of the night when all was serene and somebody came home and thought they were getting in and nobody would know what time they came home, bang went all of this tinware down the stairs. I remember one time there was a man working for my father, and his father he was a very strict person, had no sense of humor. And Wesley had never had anything like this happen to him before. And he came home in the middle of the night and he just fixed that. Well, he was scared. He knew my father would discharge him. He knew he
Just
was
knew he
off the
would.
job because, he just knew my father would, would discharge him because he caused so much trouble in the middle of the night. And he said, don't worry about it. Probably father helped him.
I always figured that a parent, when he pulled a trick like that, forfeited his right to be angry at what hour it was.
That's right. I never knew them to be angry about anything. anything like that. When we were fooling and just having a good time, you know, father and mother never interfered. But the minute somebody began to get angry, or rough, too awfully rough, then we had to stop right then. They were both strict disciplinarians, but I learned at an early age that I was a little more likely to get what I wanted if I asked my father first. But father and mother always agreed, and never did one change what the other person had said. If my father told me I could do something, even if my mother didn't think I should, I never do it. They might.
Boy, that's
They might.
Not the case now.
They might have settled it behind closed doors, but we children never knew it.
we used to settle it in the kitchen.
And no, I have always said that when we kids couldn't think of something to do, father and mother would be able to do it for us, but there usually was something going on.
What's the second half?
Then after father, when Charlie and my brother Charlie and Velma were married in December of 1908, father gave up the farm. And in 1909, father and mother and I went on a trip west, and when we came back, father bought this house in Little Valley on 8th Street. And father, mother, and I moved down there. And then father died the next year.
Why did y'all move?
Well, Charlie and Velma were living on the farm.
Oh.
Had to go somewhere, Linda.
Yeah. And so father built the barn. You can just see in the picture here at the back of the lot. And because we had a horse and buggy in those days. This was before the days of automobiles. Wherever we went with a horse and buggy. And we didn't go with an automobile. Another thing that I shall never forget as a family living at home, father and the boys would get up early. They'd have to get up early and go to the barn to milk the cows, and they might, in the summertime when they were haying, they might get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock. And then they would come in about 7 for breakfast. And then when we finished breakfast, without fail, we always had morning devotions. The family would sit around, not at the table, but around the room, and father would read from the Bible, and then we would all kneel, and father would pray, and then everybody would go on about their day's business. But that never failed. And of course, I would have said at the time that I didn't pay much attention to what my father said in those prayers. But do you know that also many times I run across verses of Scripture that he used in his prayers. Mm-hmm. So I know that he memorized. He must have memorized a great deal of Scripture. And every little while I run across something
That you remember.
and I wouldn't take anything for that memory of my father and what that meant to him and to the rest of us. So father lived until 1911, and he died in this house, and he's buried in Little Valley in the rural cemetery there. Yeah, we'll go to the page here and see what we had. Schoolhouse in those days was just over the hill toward Little Valley, district number 5. And this picture was taken probably about 1908, and Hattie Boone was the teacher there.
So nobody has shoes on.
I have.
You've got shoes on.
I have shoes on.
No,
They're
this
high
is
top, and this is Thora, my cousin, and she has shoes on. They're high button shoes. Mm-hmm.
Lenny,
Mm-hmm.
back
High
out.
button
Just a little
shoes.
bit, okay? Thank you.
And the schoolhouse that was originally built there, my father and his brothers and sisters went to school in. And my father purchased that building for $6. And it was moved over onto the farm, right in the hollow between the house and the barn, opposite the chicken coop. And later, after my brother Charlie took the farm, he moved it up to the barn, and I think he made sort of a milk house out of it or something, and it caught fire one day and burned, so that it's not there anymore. And then this was built. This building was built, and that's where all 6 of us went to school. Uh-huh. And
How old were you there? How old were you there?
1908, and I would have been about 11. Mm-hmm. So, mm-hmm. And then finally this was closed, and all the children went to Little Valley School. I don't know whether your father ever went to school there or not, but finally this building all deteriorated, and it's all fallen down. But there's a nice, beautiful grove of maple trees there where the house, the school building stood.
Is that the building that Mom and Dad did get one piece of old wormwood out of?
I don't know. They got one from another school that Hazel had attended.
Okay, that was the one.
No, this isn't the one. But those maple trees that are there, I expect that the Wilcox helped plant practically every one of them, because they were all planted on Arbor Days. And there are 2 of them that I can point to definitely that was planted when I was a little girl going to school there. But they're beautiful old maple trees now.
Now this is y'all, all of y'all?
Mm-hmm. Long time. After that my sister Iva's husband. We'll talk about him a little later.
We're not going to do all these pictures.
No. You were asking about Napoli Corners, and at the time that I was a little girl, there were 2 stores there. The Crandall store, and that was on one corner, and that burned many years ago, and has been gone. On the same side of the road, but opposite the rusty hardscrabble road, was the old inn. It was never used as an inn that I can remember. And then on the other corner was another corner was also another store that was run by a man by the name of Wheaton. There was somebody before that. I can't think of his name right now. That store was the post office when I was a little girl, before the days of rural free delivery. Mail came to East Randolph, and there was a stage. Now, not like a stagecoach like we think of in the pictures, but it was more like a double buggy that ran between East Randolph and Little Valley, and people could ride from one place to another. And he would bring the mail to Napoli and then the Corners to this store, and then we had to go there to get it. As a result, we probably got mail maybe once a week or something like that, not too frequently. And at that time, there were 4 churches there at Napoli Corners. The Present Methodist Church, which you passed, was the Congregational Church. Then right next to it was the Baptist Church. Now that was never opened that I can remember full time. Before that, it had been, but they didn't have a full-time minister, and so it had been closed. And then up around the corner was the Methodist Church, and then up the hill was the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And so there were the four churches. What was the Methodist Church at that time is all gone. There's no remnant of it there. It stood beside the old town hall. And any social events that we had for the church was held in the town hall. And of course, in those days, they paid the preacher some money, but he took most of his living by the things that they would bring to him from the farm. And so they would have these parties, these donations. And I've often thought how many times they must have been loaded up with potatoes or turnips or squashes, or the poor folks, they'd have a lot of one thing to eat, but not enough of another. There was a cheese factory one time there at Napoli. It was after, it was built. I can remember about when it was built. So it wasn't one of the very old landmarks of the place. But that was just about the only industry that I ever knew of that was there in Napoli. Now, by it must have been about 1889 or 88 that this picture was taken of the four children. At that time, there was my sister Isa and my brother Bert. He was the oldest, and then Isa, and then my brother Walter, and then my sister Carrie. She was shy a little bit. She is. And then later on, around 1907 or 8, here is Isa and Carrie again. I just love those two pictures. This one is.
Oh, let's see how much. What's the mouth in there?
We don't have a picture of my brother Charlie when he was small.
Really?
I suppose by the time.
That's a cute group of kids.
Yes, I think by the time he and I came along, the family was getting so big that they probably didn't have money enough.
Tired of doing pictures.
They were getting tired of doing pictures. And at Christmas time, the very, very first Christmas that I can remember, and I think I can only remember one of those, that we didn't have a Christmas tree at home, but everybody took their Christmas gifts and they had a Christmas tree at church. And we went there and finally, as I remember it, it got to the point where some people were bringing more gifts. Some families had more than others, and it was making some hard feelings. And so as a result, they discontinued having that. But I think that this picture is about my 4th birthday. And I don't mean birthday. It was after my 4th Christmas. And here's my doll buggy down here again.
That's you. How do you do?
Well, I probably was. I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was after 1901, so that I would have been 5, 6 years old. And but we usually.
Did Clark please stop and 30 minutes, or was that your idea?
No,
Patty,
that we could.
Okay.
That we could.
She was wanting to know.
No.
Okay. I'm sorry, did she interrupt you?
Christmases, we always went to Uncle John's house. That was my mother's brother. They lived about 3/4 of a mile down the road. And one year we would go to their house, and the next year they come back to our house. And then whoever had Christmas would have the Christmas tree. And we would take all of our gifts and put on the Christmas tree. Well, that one Christmas, I don't remember just how old I was. I wakened and I had chicken pox, and we were supposed to go to Uncle John that day. So the family all got ready and went to Uncle John's house, and about half an hour later, my brother Charlie came driving back. He had the horses and bobsled, and said that my cousins who listened for they had chicken pox that morning too. We got it at school, you know.
So y'all all had chicken pox together.
So Mother bundled me up and put me down under the robes and the bobs. And,
You probably felt okay. Just so you
well, no, we didn't feel too good. We were not very perky that day, but so anyway, that and we did that for many years. The two families having a Christmas together until families got so large that we finally and so they had the Burks had their Christmas together and we had ours. So, but that was it. Yeah. My brother Bert, my oldest brother Bert, of course, was some 19 years older than I, and around 1898, he went out to Yakima, Washington, where my Uncle Charlie was living and had the fruit farm out there. He stayed for about 2 or 3 years, came back in 1901. I recall when he came, I was so anxious to see him, but I was so shy. I hid under the dining room table. I remember it was early evening and it was dark. It must have been in the winter time. And I remember when they're driving into the yard and of my hiding, I was so anxious to see him, but I was just so shy that I went down under the table. He was married that year to a Jenny Vining who lived on the farm next to us. And their first child, Arthur, was born in 1902. That was my first nephew. And I was very much disturbed when they told me that I was his Aunt Helen. And I said, well, I won't be his Aunt Helen until I'm as old as my Aunt Helen is.
There's some Wilcox logic for you.
And I simply would not accept the fact that he was my nephew. Well, Jenny lived until 1907, and when she passed away, and then in 1910, he and Phoebe Pratt were married. She became the mother of Margaret and Wilma, Ella, and Carrie and Calvin. And they lived there. Well, after Jenny and Bert were married, they had the old place, the Dr. Samuel Wilcox place, down on the Hardscrabble Road.
Well, they weren't married very long, then were they?
No.
How long were they married?
1901 to 1907. Years. And
What did she die of?
I don't know. I don't remember. She was not well. But anyway, so Bert and Phoebe continued to live there in that place. In that house, there had been Dr. Samuel Wilcox's house. And they, here we have a picture Bert and Phoebe and Arthur, and then Margaret, so that must have been taken about 1912, because she was born in 1911, and I imagine that was taken at that time. We just have some pictures here of the girls. Margaret, the oldest one, went to married a Kenneth Herrick, and they live on a farm on beyond Wilmot, down on what is called the Sawmill Run Road. And her house is up on a hillside, and it was a very hard farm to farm because it is so very hilly. But it's a beautiful area down through there. And now her son, Robert, has built a house just a little bit nearer Wilmot than where Margaret is. A lovely new home there. And it just looks down through the valley, and it's just a beautiful view. I just thoroughly enjoy sitting out there porch and looking at the view down through Napoli. They, Bert's family, as they grew up, Margaret married, and she has two sons, Robert and Marion. Marion lives at Springville, and he's been employed by a man from Buffalo who does landscape gardening, and he owns farm after farm out near Springville, where he raises a great deal of the shrubbery and that he uses, and not only that, but ships it to various areas, Minnesota, a lot of it up into Canada, and Marion supervises all of the shipment of the looking after these farms. He's worked for him for years, and Robert had a farm and at Eagle, New York, and he sold that a few years ago. That was when he came over near Margaret's and built a home there. Kenneth died 2 years ago, and one thing I wanted to tell about Margaret particularly, I spoke about her living high up on this hillside. Here, a few years ago, they had a bad blizzard up in New York State, and I want to read about this write-up that was in the paper about her. It tells it better than I could. And then I think that when we get to the end of this, we'll take a little break.
Okay.
The Napoli Town Highway crew gives Maggie, they call her Maggie many times, a top 10-4 for her CB-based station operation from her living room during the blizzard of '77. Margaret Herrick on Sawmill Run Road retired January 1st from the Randolph Central School cafeteria and custodian staffs in time to assist the Town of Napoli Highway crew during the record blizzard by receiving messages from one snowplow to another when the truck CB units would fade out in the valleys of the hilly township. Maurice Austin, the town highway superintendent, said at one time during the height of the storm, Maggie was on duty for 16 hours. She was about the only way we could contact each other and call substitute drivers. And one day, she stayed with it from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. The blizzard is now a memory, and Maggie is pretty well back to the routine chats with her good buddies during the evening hours. She does not know her exact altitude on Sawmill Run, but she does enjoy the height that gives her small base station a pretty clear channel across Chautauqua Lake to Mayville, Westfield, and on to Fredonia. Those places are out on Lake Erie. When conditions are especially good, she can make contact with other CBers in Buffalo and Niagara Falls. She is a firm believer that the rules should be followed to the letter when on the air and has little time for nonsense chit-chat. Say your thing, say it right, and get off the air to make the channel available to someone else is Maggie's idea of a CB golden rule. Just good manners should help a lot in these days of crowded channels, she added. And Margaret just knows, it seems as though she knows just about everybody, and she's such a good friend to everybody, and they like her so much. But that was typical. She was always doing something for somebody, and it was so typical of her. I did want to speak about Terry. The daughter Terry that Bert and Phoebe had, she developed multiple sclerosis somewhere around 1940, and she lived until around 1978. That may not be an exact date, but very close to that. And she was a total invalid for the last 17 years, had to be fed, and but she was a lovely person, and Irving Hayward, her husband, deserves a great deal of credit for the care that he gave her throughout those years. I think we might take a break here.
Okay, we'll do that. Glad we'll grab a little drink of iced tea and get with it here in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Would be a good idea.
Wonder what time it is, 'cause I might need to put these together.
Ready?
You bet.
I showed pictures of my brother Bert's family and told you a little bit about them before. My sister Ida was born 2 years after my brother Bert. She was born in 1879, and her health was never too good, and she was always at home, and she did a great deal of sewing. She did nearly all the sewing for the girls of the family and for mother, and later on in life for all of our nieces, and some things for our nephews as well. Along about 1909, a man by the name of John Henderson, an osteopathic physician, came to Salamanca, and later on, perhaps around 1916, she went to him for treatment. I think it was probably the first time we had ever heard of osteopathy.
Mm-hmm.
Early in 1918, his wife died, and later on that year, he and Ida began going together, and were married the following May. Then they went to live in Olean. He had practiced in Salamanca up until this time, but they went to Olean, and we're right across the big street from the Mountain Clinic there, a private hospital, but people that cooperated with him, and surgical patients there, and so forth. He was in Salamanca at the time of the bad flu epidemic. You may never have heard of it, but in the fall of 1918, there was a terrible flu epidemic. It started in Europe, and then it came to the United States. You see that the boys of the First World War were in camps. They died like flies, and people at home, they would go through whole families, and people were here and gone tomorrow. They developed pneumonia very quickly and would be gone. there were some places that they couldn't get caskets rapidly enough to bury their dead. And he was practicing in Salamanca at that time. The doctors just went day and night during those times. And he told about one morning about 4 o'clock he came home and he was so utterly exhausted he felt that he just could not go again. And he had just gotten to bed when his phone rang and somebody's little girl was sick. And he told them that I had forgotten how long it had been since he had any rest. And he said, I just feel as though I just can't go any longer. And they said, well, what if it was your little girl? So he got up and went. But he eventually, one day, toward the end of the epidemic, went up to Olean. This was after his wife had died, and went up to this mountain clinic. And he went in and told them he had to go to bed. And they said, why, doctor, we don't have a vacant bed in this hospital. The hospitals were just crammed full, and they had cots set up in the hallways. And he said, I don't care, I've got to go to bed somewhere. Well, they said, we've got a cot in the surgery, and he said, the surgeons are all sick, so can't anybody operate? If you want to go in there and go to bed, you may. And so he went in there, and he slept for 48 hours. And he was utterly exhausted. They lived in Salamanca, and in 1921, they adopted Ruth, and there's some pictures of her. This was their home in Olean. The office was at the side here, and these were the living quarters. Then they built a cottage up at Cuba Lake on lot 365, and all the good times that we had up there. I don't think there was ever anybody that enjoyed doing for other people as much as Dr. did. It was funny, but we never got to calling him by his first name. We always called him Doctor.
Doctor.
We always called him Doctor. The nieces and nephews called him Uncle John, but somehow the rest of us always called him Doctor. And he just thoroughly enjoyed having the family all come up there. And I recall one day, all of Bert's family and all of Charlie's family had been up, and they were out in the yard, and your Uncle Marion called Grandma to the door, and he said, Grandma, look out there in the yard. And she looked out, and he said, just see what you and Grandfather were responsible for.
See what you've done.
And, there was a whole yard full of people, and we had such a good time. And Ida was a very sweet person. She did beautiful handwork, and she really was more of a mother to me than a sister. I've always said I had 2 sets of parents, she and Dr. My own father couldn't have been better to me than he was. He was just a wonderful man, and I lived with them as long as they were living, and helped take care of them when they at the end. And when they moved back to Salamanca in 1934, they moved into this house, and then they 2 years later they moved over to this one, which is the one that you and
that I remember.
That you remember.
I banged my teeth on a curve right down about here one time on a sled. Do you remember that?
Did you?
Oh, yeah.
No, I don't remember that.
I'll never forget it.
Isn't it funny how we remember some of those things?
If I remember right, there was a flood gauge in the back, down toward the river, in the back of the house. There were markings from the high water.
Where
on
the
the
house?
post
Yes,
or something.
it had come. One time it came up. There was a tree back here, right about in here. It just had been removed when this picture was taken, and the water came through that. But believe it or not, now this basement here, I don't know whether you remember the basement, but it was a good 6 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
The water had never touched the house, anything that we had had. Well, they had some flood control projects there in Salamanca, and they built this high retaining wall down back of this house now. might in 100 years have one flood that would be enough to go over the top of that retaining wall.
How many
And
times
it
is
was
that?
within the next month they had it. And believe it or not, it came to within 3 inches of the first floor of this building. And it had never even touched the house before.
Mm.
We couldn't believe it. And in places it came up on Broad Street.
Amazing.
I was glad I wasn't living there anymore.
Thank goodness for modern technology, huh?
That's, yeah.
They just left it alone. They'd have been
They
right.
just, that's right. But, we had a flood there annually. Ruth still lives in Salamanca, and she was just now waiting, hoping to get into the very nice retirement home that they had there. Doctor lived until December of 1941, and Isa lived until March of 1942. They both passed away that same winter. And they're both buried in Salamanca Cemetery. And then there was my brother Walter. Walter never liked the farm. He didn't like the cows. He really didn't like any part of the farm. And our Aunt Lucy Peacock lived over in Gowanda. And so I think he and Bert and Harry and Isa all, at one time or another, stayed with Aunt Lucy and went to school over in Gowanda. My brother Charlie and I used to kid to this day we were the only ones that never had to go to Gowanda. Gowanda had a state mental hospital. So we were the only ones that never
They
had
could
to
have
go.
rewritten the old song. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Gowanda?
Yeah. And Walter graduated from Little Valley High School, though. And Lucy moved to Little Valley, and Walter graduated from there, put in 1 year of postgraduate work in high school, and then he went to Syracuse University and took electrical engineering. When he graduated in 1905, he went to Pittsburgh and worked for one of the big electrical companies there. And then he and Catherine were married. She also was a Syracuse graduate and had taught for a year. And then they went to Berwyn, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. And while they were there, their daughter Elizabeth was born. And she was never very well. She had a rheumatic heart condition, and she died when she was 13 years old. Then their son Gordon was born. So before Gordon was born, they had gone to Portland, Oregon. A friend of Uncle Walter's, supposedly a friend, went out there first and looked over the situation and wrote my brother that there were just any number of openings for electrical engineers out there. Well, when he got out there, he found there weren't so many openings, and he had quite a difficult time, but he lived 2 or 3 different places around there, and Gordon was born after they went to Portland. They Catherine lived until about 1948, 48, and she passed away, and she was cremated and is at the crematorium there in the mausoleum there in Portland. And Walter also, he lived till 1969. He was later, the next year, married Edith. She lived until 1957. They were not married so many years, but they were very, very happy together, and she filled a great place in his life for him. Gordon grew up and attended the State University on the West Coast now. But Gordon passed away very suddenly with a heart attack in '65. And he was the one, after he was divorced from his first wife, who married Kareem. You remember Kareem? They were here for the reunion last spring.
You bet I did.
Mm-hmm. And they, of course, the children now are grown, and here we have a picture of Kareem and Gordon. And then Walter, there were 4 other children, and there was Jack. We got another one here first. Here's Dick, and he had 3 girls and a boy, Judy and Joanne and Gail, and Joanne was here one time. She and her husband and 2 boys. They live on a small fruit farm, and they have a most interesting life. And Dick's boy, unfortunately, was killed on his bicycle when he was 12 years old. And he married Joanne or Jean, and they lead a very busy life. And since his retirement.
The past several years, I've seen them, at least once a year, and
Yes.
sometimes a couple of times a year.
Mm-hmm.
Good folks.
Mm-hmm. And then there was their brother Jack and Irene, and they live up in the state of Washington, near Pasco. They went there around 1956, and they had very little to start on. But this farm that they took had been cleared, but all around them it was nothing but sagebrush. And the first time that I ever saw it, I think, was in '58. And I'll never forget, you could look as far as you could see, and there were no other buildings, and just this sagebrush and sand. But their acreage was all green because it was irrigated from the Grand Coulee.
And there's no barren wilderness that's any more barren than that area out there.
And then, as I have visited them through the years, and that area has been developed, now you wouldn't know that there had been any tumbleweeds in it, hardly. It's all, and he has about 120 acres of asparagus now. He has 2 sons. Warren was here, you recall, and he was one of the Golden Eagles. Is that connected with the Air Force or with the Army?
It's the Golden Knights, I think, and yes, it's the Army paratroop team. The only time I think we ever saw him work with them was when they were here for the opening of the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport.
Yeah, that's as I remember. He now is in Saudi Arabia, helping to run a farm over there for a prince. And he has a brother, Wayne, who is a physicist, and he works at the Richland Atomic Energy plant there in Richland. You get them all. There's Jack. Where's Whit? I got to have Whit here.
Well, here's a picture of Whit.
Yeah.
But I don't see the rest.
No, here's Marion. Here's his daughter Marion, and here she is again, and this is a terrible picture of Dee.
Oh, I don't know.
She's so pretty.
Oh,
and for some reason, that doesn't look so nice as she does. And her father, Ernie, and her husband, Gary, and her son, Jason.
No, this guy's a killer, too.
Yes,
I like Jason.
Yes, he's cute. Marion and Ernie had a little boy, Jack, who died of leukemia when he was 5 or 6. And here's Whit. And Whit spent his working years with the Air Force and had many interesting things that we'll touch on later. And his wife, Kathy, and then he had the 3 daughters, and Patsy and Linda and Susan. Fortunately, Patsy has passed away, but the other 2 girls are living. And Whit and Patty live in Vacaville, California. And that, and then there was Aunt Carrie.
Aunt Carrie.
Yes.
Sister Carrie.
My sister Carrie, yes.
We're going to confuse people yet with that.
Yes.
But that's okay. Every time we've said Aunt Carrie, we've said Sister Carrie, too.
Sister Carrie, too. That's right, my sister Carrie. My sister Carrie was married in 1907 to a little waif there in Napoleon. He was a local boy and gave music lessons. In fact, the first piano lessons that I ever had, I had of him.
So he's who we can blame, huh?
Yes, yes. But I think I only had about 5 or 6. Anyway, when they were married, they went to Niagara Falls on their honeymoon, and they were having a typhoid epidemic there, and he became infected, and he died just 6 weeks from the day they were married.
Mm.
And so after that, she went into Rochester to the Rochester General Hospital there and took up nursing. And in 1914, she married Edgar Fossman, an MD who had started practice in East Randolph. They went there to live. They had no children of their own, but while they were in East Randolph, they took a girl whose mother was a widow, and she was having a difficult time getting along. And she was with them for several years, and Ed had made all arrangements for her to go to New York to study nursing in the fall. And that summer, she had a ruptured appendix. Now, this was back in probably around 1920. It was before the days of antibiotics and so forth. And she developed peritonitis and passed away. And Ed never could quite forgive himself, feeling that he should have diagnosed the case earlier. But I'm sure he did everything that he possibly could. Then later on, they took Daisy Harrison, and she lived with them all through high school, and later married Jack Harrison, and they live in Wellfield, New York. He's a Baptist minister, was one, retired now, and then Wilma's sister, Carrie, she lived with them and went to high school, and then I think she had a year at business college in Hornell. Stayed with them before she married Irving Taylor. This was their home in East Randolph. Then was her first husband, when Ed passed away in 49, and she's later in 1955 married Charles Glover and went back to East Randolph to live. That's where he had lived. He and his brother and their wives had been great friends of Carrie's and Ed's all through the years.
That's one of the names that I've Charlie's Lover came up so many years.
Yes, well,
In fact, if I remember correctly, Bill Reed and Charlie's Lover were good friends.
Bill who?
Bill Reed, Hazel's husband. Weren't they good
Well,
friends at some point?
No, they might have been. They would have been acquainted, I'm sure, but I don't know whether.
I-
Yeah, they probably were.
I think I remember. Those were some of the stories I
Yeah.
specifically remember. I think
Uh-huh.
Bill talking about Charlie.
Charlie and his brother Late had a feed mill in East Randolph for many years, and it's now an energy center where they're getting together historical things from the county and then trying to do things for conservation
Mm-hmm.
through there.
Family, I recognize one ugly mug in here anyway.
Yes. Then, by the way, speaking of Aunt Carrie and Uncle Ed, they are buried in the East Randolph Cemetery. And my brother Charlie.
Grandpa Charlie.
Yes, you think of him as Grandpa Charlie.
I sure do.
Yeah, he was 7 years older than I. Just enough older, you know, that as a little boy, he used to think he could boss me around. But by the time he grew up, he really was an awfully nice chap.
Yeah.
But sometimes when he was little, I questioned it. And he and Velma were both 19 when they were married. And some people criticized my father for being willing to sign his marriage license. At that time.
19, was that young in that day and age?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Was it?
Oh, yes.
Because, see, earlier in history, that would have been getting on in years
Yes,
to get married.
But it was that then. And I remember the night they were married. It was December 1st, and it was not much snow, but it was cold and rainy, and they went to live on the old farm. This picture here is the only picture I know of. It's a picture of Grandpa Charlie when he was about 12 years old, and Father had just given him this team of horses. Colt. Mm-hmm. That is probably the youngest picture that I had of Grandpa Charlie. And so this picture shows him with the four boys. Howard, Jim, Norman, and Marion. And
Handsome boys.
yes, they were.
Handsome.
You know, the night that your father Jim was married,
I think I remember a story about that.
the minister, after the ceremony, before we went on the reception at the farm, they were taking pictures there in the church. And the minister and I were standing at the back of the church talking, and of course Norm and Marion were ushers, and Howard was best man. And when they were taking these pictures, the minister said to me, "It's a crime for one couple to have four such good-looking boys."
Now I remember a story. I think it was the night Mom and Dad were married. There's a story about Grandpa Charlie and an ambulance pulled onto somebody's front porch and set the ring in it, and him and a bunch of guys just leaving it. Now, was that Mom and Dad? We'll have to ask and figure that out.
No, I don't remember about that.
I bet you somebody watching this remembers.
The biggest story of the night that you or that your father and mother were married, that night after
you see, this was in 1941, and it was very difficult. We were at the beginning of the Second World War, and it was very difficult to get tires for our cars.
Mm-hmm.
So your father came to me and wanted to know if he could use the tires on my car, which were new, on his car. They would fit his car. And then he would put his tires on my car.
Right.
And he'd have the to drive, you know. Well, then he wanted...
Sounds
no,
like my dad.
yeah. No, I guess I'm wrong on that. He wanted to take my car. That was it. He wanted to take my car. And so, and he would leave his because he was having trouble with it. That was it. And there was something about switching tires, but I don't recall now exactly what it was. So I told him that I would, but I wasn't to tell anybody. And he was making everyone think that he was going to take your Uncle Howard's car. Mm-hmm. And Howard supposed he was. So your father and I didn't exactly trust each other. I wasn't so sure that he wasn't doing this to put me off, to make me think he was going to take my car, but was really going to take somebody else's. And he wasn't so sure that I wouldn't tell somebody.
I bet.
And so anyway, the night came, and I made it a point to be among the last to get up to the Napoli from the church, and I parked the car up ahead of all of the other cars, and then I left the key in the car where he could get to it, you know. And when I got in the house, I told him where I had left the car. Well, Howard supposed he was going to take his car, and so they had it in the yard, and they had that car decorated, and just having the time of their lives, you know.
Oh yeah.
And when your father and mother came down the stairs and went out, instead of their turning left to go over to their car, they turned right and started up the highway toward mine. And well, they were also flabbergasted that they couldn't just decide what they were doing, you know. Mm-hmm. Well, it had stormed that night, rained and frozen on, and the road was so slippery. So he got up and got in my car, and by this time, folks had collected their thoughts and had come up to where your father and mother were parked, and they couldn't get up onto the highway. It was so slippery, you know.
Oh, no. So there they were, dead ducks.
And they were just dead ducks there. Well, they finally, they did. They pushed him up onto the highway. They threw a little rice into the car, but nothing to what they had expected to do, you know. And after they pulled away, I said to my sister Carrie, "May I ride back to Salamanca with you?" And she said, she stopped and thought a minute, and she said, "Was that your car?" And I said, "Yes."
Yeah, it certainly was.
She said, "No, you can walk all the way back."
Helping them get away, huh?
Oh, they were all, then after Velma passed away, he married Helen Mackenzie, and she had lived in Napoli as a girl. We had known her for quite some time. And,
I saw her last time was probably 4 or 5 years ago. Jack and I, we were up in that area and dropped by.
yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, she was so glad to have him. And of course, Marion and Phil eventually married, and they have Lyle, and he lives in Tucson. He's a music teacher.
You see them quite frequently.
Mm-hmm. And Joyce, her daughter, and Dale, another son who was a graduate psychologist. And
Uncle Norm.
yes, sir, and then there was your Uncle Norm. they, the boys in your grandfather's family were Marion and Norm were fairly close together.
Mm-hmm.
And then it went quite a long time, and then your father and Jim, and then Howard were born, so that there was quite a vast difference in ages, and so that and Norm had the two girls. Tony lives on a big hog farm in Illinois, and Norman and Ann are living in King City in Oregon, and Lois is married and living in Los Alamos. No, she doesn't live in Los Alamos. Then was it?
I don't know. The last time I saw them was at the San Mateo County Fair, which is San Jose.
Well,
it's that area.
It's in that area, yes. And we got a little ahead of our story. Your father and mother.
Yeah, there they are. Look at the hair on that boy.
Oh, yes, he still does have.
Next time he talks about my weird hairdo, I'm going to grab this picture and show it to him. That's one of my favorite pictures.
Yes,
That's the other three.
Mm-hmm.
In my family.
That's right. I like this picture of you and Jack.
Oh, me and my shadow.
Yes, sir. That's right. And I think we should, pretty near have a whole unit on you two boys and the development of the shop and all of the interesting experiences that you have had.
The grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Jack has Charlie and Julie.
Yeah.
And there's Lindsay and Jennifer on my side.
Yeah.
Is that Bonnie?
Yes, that's Bonnie. Jack and Bonnie.
Jack and Bonnie. So this must be the house on Yates Road.
Yes. And,
And I barely remember that.
you just barely remember. You were born in Memphis, weren't you?
Mm-hmm. The thing I remember most about that is the sheep farmer that had his place across the street. I can remember all the sheep.
Uh-huh.
But I thought that was
Jack also at that time had a duck, I think, by the name of Bohunk.
Bohunk, that's right.
The way I happen to remember it, when he was up in Salamanca with his mother, he said his prayers one night.
God
And
bless.
he said, God bless Bonnie and Bohunk and Daddy.
Yeah.
Daddy came to
They
the
would laugh. After a dog and a duck.
Yeah.
Dog, duck, and daddy.
Uh-huh.
You'd think it's strange having a duck for a pet, but I've got to tell you that Lyle and Rosemary and all those folks, they got a duck for a pet.
Have they?
I've forgotten what its name is, but they had a duck.
Good.
One of the last times we were there.
Yes.
They sure did.
Mm-hmm. Then Howard, the youngest boy of Jim's family, had 6 children, and he likes to say that he always wanted to have 6 children like his grandmother had. That would be my mother. And when he got to the 6th one, before he had the 6th one, he hesitated a long time because he looked at the 6th one that my mother had.
And thought, I don't know.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but he has 6 children.
When they get together, it's a crowd. Isn't it?
Oh, yes. I think his 14th grandchild is on the way now. Mm-hmm.
My word. And what are all their names?
Well, here's Howard and Alice.
Right.
And then Denny. And Nancy. Mm-hmm. And Howard, or Buddy as we call him. And Gary. And Debbie. And
put you to the test here.
Yes. Oh, Teresa.
Okay.
And these are the grandchildren.
Well, look at 'em.
Look at them. Aren't they cute?
That's what I say, when they get together, it's a crowd.
It surely is. When I was up there the last time, she invited some of them over for dinner at night, and then some of the rest who didn't come for dinner came in the evening. And I tell you, it's a house full when they all get there. But they're all just nice kids. And,
Good family for hand-me-down clothes.
yes,
I bet the baby clothes are worn out by the time they get through.
I bet they are too. I bet they are too. More family pictures, and this was Howard when he was a little boy, tarring the milk house up on the old farm. This is looking down toward the road.
When I saw this stepladder, I thought of the story about Jack and the little fawn, that he was hollering bear, bear in the backyard. I thought maybe that's what that was.
No,
but then
no.
Obviously looking at it, it's
Uh-huh.
a whole different deal. And of course,
Yes.
Auntie.
And I think we will leave these until later.
we got to do a unit on you.
Yes, now you got a unit on me.
A whole unit on you.
A whole unit on me.
Well, we'll take a break and continue this another evening.
Yes.
Okay?
I was going to tell Linda. She said tonight that she didn't know that I had any antique jewelry. And I said, yes, I was wearing my antique jewelry tonight. This ring that I have belonged to Aunt Nettie Bigelow,
right.
Seeger, and after she passed away, Mother had it. And then when Mother died, I had it. It has a little black and white cameo. So I suppose that is probably well over 100 years old now. My earrings were cufflinks that Martha gave to Ralph Smith as a wedding gift. And Ralph Smith was a grandson of John Spencer Bigelow.
Okay.
And my necklace that I have on was a pendant. This pendant is really a slide. My Aunt Lucy, my father's sister, had a watch with a chain. Now, at one time in history, ladies wore their watches on a long chain and tucked them into their waistband. And that was what she did. And she had this slide on that long chain. I don't know whatever became of the watch, but I eventually inherited the slide and the chain. I have 3 necklaces made from the chain. It was so long that I could have. And then I had this slide put on it. And sometime within, I would have said, the last 15 years, one day I was looking at a tintype picture that I have of her, and she is wearing that same slide with her long chain. And so I really treasure it. And your mother...
I was going to ask, is that the one that my mother borrows from you?
Yeah, well, she has the antique shop, and as she goes out, sometimes somebody asks her to give a lecture somewhere, and she will wear this and take along the picture of Aunt Lucy wearing it. So I suppose this is around 100 years old now, too.
Pays to take care of things.
I guess it does.
Well, we'll take a break and do some more later on.
All right.
you know, when one lives to as many years as I have, to try to condense those years into an hour or two is a major feat, particularly when you have lived from the horse and buggy days through the great industrial revolution of the 20th century to the beginning of the computer age. There have been so many, many changes and things of interest that have happened during that time that it makes it especially difficult. I think we have a tendency to divide our lives into periods where certain things have happened that stand out in our minds, and so I'm going to begin first with my childhood, because I would like you to know something about the family, how we lived in those days, what we had, and I want you to, those of you who never met my brothers and sisters, I want you to feel that perhaps you knew them as well. When I was born in 1896, as I've said before, we were living on Miller Hill in Napoli, in Cattaraugus County, New York. The family consisted of course father and mother, and my oldest brother Bert, who was in school at the time, then my sister Isa, and my brother Walter. Walter was over at Gowanda with my Aunt Lucy Peacock, going to school over there. He stayed with her and went to high school, and much to his dismay, she moved to Little Valley during his senior year, or else just before that. And so he had to graduate from Little Valley High School rather than at Gowanda, where he had attended school for the other 3 years. He was in the first graduating class from the Little Valley High School. There were only 3 or 4, I believe, in it. Pardon me. Carrie my sister Carrie was attending the little country school there, just beyond our farm toward Little Valley. The schoolhouse itself is no longer standing. But and Charlie, my 7-year-old brother, he was attending school there also. Then my step-grandmother, Nancy Wilcox, lived in the little house across the road that she and my grandfather had built. I don't know just when, but my own grandmother died in 1867. And when my grandfather made out his will in 1878, they evidently were living in that house because he wills the house to his second wife, Nancy. And by the time I was born, he had passed away, but grandmother was still living there. She later went to live with her sister down in the Poli Corners, and father sold the house, and it was moved down through the Narrows, and was put on a foundation just as you left the Narrows going toward Little Valley. I can't recall whether the house burned or whether it just deteriorated, but anyway, it's no longer there. And I don't recall whoever lived in it afterwards, but Bill Stevens bought it and placed it on some land that he owned there. I remember when they moved it. It was quite a different process than from today. They placed rollers under the house, and then they had a team apart. I don't remember whether they had a team or one horse that was attached to a wheel with a rope going back to the house, and this horse went round and round. I had no idea now just how it was worked, but anyway, it just moved inches at a time. And I can remember it. They moved it over the fields as much as they could, and then, but finally, when they came to the narrows, they had to put it on the highway and to get down through there because it was so narrow. I don't know where people went with their horses and buggies at that time to get through the narrows while they got down through there. But anyway, that was the way it was moved, and I didn't remember of seeing the horse or the horses going round and round and round and round all day long. And as the men would run to get these rollers underneath the house in time so that the house wouldn't come off on them. But then my grandfather and grandmother Bert had built a home on the Little Valley Napoli Road between our place and the Napoli Corners, and had moved over there. And or if they hadn't moved by the time I was born, they had moved there by the time I can remember at all. But I think they had by that time. And right across the road from them lived their son John, my mother's brother. Uncle John and his wife, my Aunt Effie. They had a boy and a girl at that time, Thora and Louis. They were just about the ages of Charlie and myself. So that we were played together and were almost like brothers and sisters during those years that we lived on the farm. Charlie and Louis, of course, were somewhat older than Thora and me. But then the Bigelows lived about 10 miles over the hills over in Conowongo. And so that was the family at that time with our the Wilcox family and the people who had come, our ancestors who had come from New England to live in western New York. Lysander Wilcox was the only one left that I ever remember of seeing of the children of the Reverend William J. Wilcox, the minister who came from New England. He lived just below the house built by Dr. Samuel Wilcox, and the one where Bert went when he was married and purchased the place there. And so, with the exception of a few years, that place has always been in the possession of the Wilcox, some member of the Wilcox family. And when he passed away, Wilma and Calvin took it over. So, we had no automobile, we had no telephone. We had kerosene lamps for lighting. Of course, we had we had one very lovely one that was always on the parlor table. Then there was another big one that we always had on the dining room table. The dining room table was in the living room. And in the evening, we would sit around this table for light, you know. Some would be reading, and we might be playing games, or, we had played flinch and checkers, and let's see, what else did we have? Thora and Louis had a crokinole board, and we could play 2 or 3 different games on that. And when I was down there, that would be another game that we would be playing. And but life really centered around the family and the church. Sundays were a very strict day. We were not allowed to. We weren't allowed to play ball. We weren't allowed to do very much of anything on Sunday except go to church and sometimes in the afternoon Carrie and Isa, and sometimes they let me go with them. they go for a hike, and sometimes we go over onto the hill overlooking Nepali off to the west there, and I always thoroughly enjoyed going with them, and I can remember those times very vividly. Father and mother were strict disciplinarians, but I hardly know how to express it. And never in well, they never prohibited us from having fun. Perhaps that is the best. Just as long as we were having fun, no one was getting angry, no one was doing anything that they shouldn't do. Father and mother never interfered. But if we weren't doing what we were supposed to, we would have to stop immediately. At the table, whenever for a meal, we always had the blessing. Father always has the blessing. In those days, children were never involved in that. It was always Father who did it. I went to many missionary meetings and ladies' aid meetings with my mother. These would be held in the daytime at the various farm homes of members of the church, Methodist church there. And I've always said that all my life I have eaten at the last table. In those days, the children had to wait until the adults had eaten, and then they might eat. And I can remember wishing that those women would stop talking and get up to the table and let us have our dinner because we were hungry. And then about the time I grew up, they changed things and decided that they'd let the children eat first, and then the adults eat last. So I've eaten at the last table all of my life. I guess that doesn't me any harm. Also at the table, we were taught pretty basic table manners. There's some of the things that I remember. One of them was we weren't allowed to reach past other people to get something out of it. If we wanted an extra serving of something, we had to say, please pass such and such thing. I remember one time we had some biscuit for supper. And I said, pass the biscuit. And my father said, well, what do you say? Now, I can't remember that I just wanted to be stubborn. As I remember it, it was more that I was embarrassed, but I couldn't make myself say please. And I just wouldn't say it. And he said, all right, you get down and go in and get up on the bed. So I can remember that they all finished eating. And the men went to the barn to do the chores, and I was still on the bed. After a while, I said to Mother, I'm hungry. Can I get up? And she said, well, you say please. Well, I eventually said it and had my supper, but I don't know why I was so stubborn.
We've all been there.
And speaking of that bed reminds me of another incident. Living over to the north of us, maybe 3/4 of a mile, was a family by the name of Cherry. The grandfather had come here from Ireland, and his granddaughter was just my age. And we were great friends, so I liked to go over there. Well, when I was maybe 5 years old, I don't know. I'm sure I wasn't more than that. My mother let me go over there one day. Well, it was the spring of the year. and it was muddy, and I had a pair of boots. We always had boots in those days. Of course, we had no sidewalks out there in the country. And the ditches were full of water. And my mother said to me, now, Helen, your boots are old, and you know they leak up at the top of your heel. So she said, don't go wading in the water. Well, when I got ready to come home, Mary came part way with me. And Mary had some new boots, and of course she could wade in the water. And so well, if she does, I don't see any reason why I can't. So I did. And I arrived home with some wet feet. And this is the only time I can ever remember my mother whipping me.
For wet feet.
For disobeying her.
Mm-hmm.
For she had specifically told me that I was not to do that. So she sent me to bed. There was a little single bed in Father and Mother's room, and I was still sleeping in there, so I must have been very young age. Well, over back of this bed, the wallpaper had started loosening just a little bit from the wall down by the mopboard. And I was so mad at my mother. I reached down there and I just kept pulling away at this loose wallpaper. Well, I don't remember much about pulling that wallpaper away, but I can remember finally leaning over the front of the bed and looking through underneath, and here was all this wallpaper and plaster on the floor that I had pulled off of the wall. Now, I don't remember what my mother did to me when she found that, but it should have been a plenty.
Funny, Jennifer, at a little younger than that, pulled the same stunt and pulled the wallpaper off the house, the wall in the house in Meadowlark.
She did. Well, I'm glad to know I'm not the only Wilcox.
So we know where she got it.
Now you know where she got it. But I do remember one thing that my mother said to me one time that I remembered all my life. Our garden was between the house and the cemetery. And we had some currant bushes out there. One summer the currants were ready to be picked, and I went out with my mother to help her pick them. And of course, childlike, in a few minutes, I had had enough of it and wanted to go play. And why this should have made such an impression, I don't know, but Mother said to me, Helen, if you don't learn to stick to things, you'll never amount to anything. And I have thought of that so many times because all my life I've been a good starter. I always hate to sew the second sleeve into it. I can be enthusiastic over the first sleeve, but I hate to sew the second one in. I love to cut out a dress, but I hate those last little stitches that you have to take to finish it up. And that has, her saying that day has always stayed by me. If you don't learn to stick to a thing, you'll never amount to anything. It was pretty good advice.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, depending upon the time of year would depend upon what the family was doing. In the early spring, there would be the maple sugar season. And at the back of the farm, there was a nice grove of maple trees. I have been told how many. I hope I'm right when I say about 300. So Father always made maple sugar. During the winter months, they cut wood and stacked it near the sugar house, which was over at the edge of the woods. And then when we began to have warm days and freezing nights, why, they would tap the maple trees, the hard maple. And then the sap was brought to the house and sugar house, where it was boiled down. And in those days, after it was boiled down at the sugar house, then it was brought to the house. And then my mother would, what they call, cleanse it. She would heat it up again, and the syrup. And as I remember, sometimes they used a potato, and sometimes eggshells.